Another spat seems to be brewing between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Israeli government. It all started after John Kerry expressed his concern over the lack of progress at peace negotiations with the Palestinians. Well, Mr. Kerry, who has been holding back and forth talks with both sides, said over the weekend that the status quo being maintained by Israel is not sustainable. And he also warned that many countries could seek to boycott Tel Aviv if peace negotiations fail. Now, this triggered an angry response with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that any efforts to boycott Israel would be unjustified and counterproductive. Israel's strategic affairs minister then weighed in, saying Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with a gun to its head. And the economy minister went a step further, calling on Israel's allies to stand up against those who try to pursue anti-Semitic agendas against his country. Well, there's been a public backlash, too, with some 2,000 Israelis gathering outside the Western Wall in Jerusalem last week for a prayer rally against U.S. efforts to broker an agreement. The two sides resumed peace talks last July. A deadline has been set for April, with Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem remaining a key sticking point. Let's now bring in Amir Oren. He's a senior correspondent and columnist for Haaretz newspaper. Thank you so much, Mr. Oren, for joining us here on RT International to discuss this. So, what do you make of Israelis' reaction, and especially the Israeli government, to Kerry's words? I mean, could they be overreacting?
Diplomatically, it makes no sense at all for Netanyahu and his government to try and fight President Obama and Secretary Kerry and their administration. But that is because politically it must make some sense. The target audience is the Israeli public as the deadline approaches for the Kerry outline, the framework agreement between Israel and Palestine to be unveiled, and because this particular framework is going to be palatable to most of the Israeli public, Netanyahu is aiming at his right flank. His political base within the Likud party and with other parties and groups to the right of it is against the Kerry paradigm, and therefore it all means that Netanyahu, rather than starting to lay the ground publicly for an acceptance of the Kerry proposals, is going to be actively working against them.
All right. Well, as we know, business and politics often go together, and some of the European businesses have already stopped or limited trade with Israeli businesses in West Bank settlements. Why does that not concern Israel, or does it?
Long term, it does concern Israel to a great extent. The impact has not been greatly felt yet, except in the occupied territories where Israeli businesses have already been boycotted to some extent by other importers world over, because people have made the distinction between products of the West Bank and those of Israel proper. But now, the threat is that all Israeli products could be boycotted because of Israel's policy vis-à-vis the territories. This is indeed a cause for concern.
And in your opinion, will the Israeli government ever back down to the question of settlements?
The Israeli government is right now politically dependent on the settlers and their supporters. Israel must have another round of elections and another sort of coalitions or governments before it can sign the sort of peace agreement that Secretary Kerry is probably preparing. However, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas must come forward and help those pro-peace groups in Israel fight the Netanyahu government policy, because up to now, Mahmoud Abbas, has been too silent on his part of the deal.
Well, the deadline for peace deal is in April. And how realistic, in your opinion, is it for Israel to meet that deadline? And also, what is Israel already doing? What sort of steps is it taking to reach it?
It's quite a flexible due date. It's not really a deadline because it could move backwards or forwards a few weeks or even months. It is only a framework agreement. This is not the peace deal, the end of claims, the end of the conflict that everybody here has been hoping for, but not everyone has been willing to pay the price for. So what we have to see in a few weeks' time is the release of the last batch of Palestinian prisoners who have been held in Israeli jails since 1993 or even earlier, even before the Oslo process. Once this is over, the two sides, Palestinians and the Israelis, are going to weigh their options and find out whether there is going to be a trilateral American-Israeli-Palestinian deal or only an American-Palestinian formula that Israel would have to either accept or reject. In the latter case, there will probably be a political crisis within Israel.
All right, Amir Oren, senior correspondent for Haaretz newspaper. Thank you so much for your views here on RT International.